My name is Mary Wood, and I'd like to welcome you to the Fall 2024 Public Affairs Talks entitled Elections 101. I am Mary Wood. I'm the Director of Public Affairs Support, and will be serving as today's moderator. My office is pleased to bring this program to you as we explore the Electoral College, safe and secure elections, and various resources to access nonpartisan election information. We are using the Zoom webinar format today, so therefore our audience attendees will not be on the screen. We will just have our speakers. And if you have a question, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A function. We will get to as many of those as we can after the presentation. I know there'll probably be a lot of questions because I have a lot of questions about all of these topics. But if you have friends or family members that you would like to see this who weren't able to log on today, we will be recording this session, and it will be available on the Public Affairs website probably later tomorrow sometime. And that website is publicaffairs.missouri-state.edu. So I'd like to go ahead and start introducing our speakers. Speaking on the topic of the Electoral College today is Dr. Kevin Pybus, Associate Professor of Political Science at Missouri State University. He also serves as the pre-law advisor here on campus, and his research interests focus on issues of law and religion. Dr. Pybus has spoken on the topic of the Electoral College through multiple media outlets, both locally and nationally, and has contributed his work to multiple law reviews over the years. I'm pleased to say that Kevin was our Provost Fellow for Public Affairs during the 2016-17 academic years, so I got a chance to know him a little better then. So we're happy to have you today, and welcome, Dr. Pybus.
Hello.
Next, thank you.
I'm sorry, I jumped the gun.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead.
The next person who will speak is hopefully going to be Mr. Shane Scholler. He's the Greene County Clerk and Chief Elections Officer for Greene County. He was initially elected to this position in 2014 and is currently serving his third term. In his role as Chief Elections Official for Greene County, Shane was appointed by Senator Roy Blunt in early 2015 to serve as a member of the advisory board for the Federal Elections Assistance Commission, or the EAC. The EAC serves as a national clearinghouse for information and review of procedures with respect to the administration of elections. In 2021, Shane was also appointed to fill a vacancy in the United States Election Assistance Commission Technical Guidelines Development Committee. That's a mouthful there. A committee that assists the EAC by adopting resolutions and making recommendations regarding the development of voluntary voting system guidelines. So we will welcome Shane when he arrives. Our final speaker will be on the topic of nonpartisan voter resources and what's on the ballot. And that will be Dr. Suzanne Walker Pacheco, Professor of Anthropology at Missouri State University. Suzanne shares her enthusiastic passion for voting to help others find and use their voices through civic engagement and active voting practices. In 2020, she and a group of students began the campus initiative Pause to the Polls. Through her passion to help educate people on the voting process and resources available, Suzanne and the students have reached well over 12,000 individuals, with that number growing every day. So we will welcome Dr. Walker Pacheco too. So right now I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Pybus, and let's hear some about the Electoral College, what it is, and why we still have it.
Hi, well, thank you. I guess the first point I want to make is that the words or phrase Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution at all. That's a name given to it by the public. The word electors does appear, so Electoral College follows from that. And so I mean, as everyone knows, I think it's a very odd way of selecting an office holder. But the U.S. Constitution, one legal scholar years ago described it as a bundle of compromises. And so most aspects or facets of it were compromises. There were competing views on how to accomplish, the different things that the Constitution applies to. And so the method of selection of how we select the president was a compromise. It was a compromise between those who wanted a direct election, having the people decide, and it was a compromise. The other major position asserted was having Congress itself select. And so it's a compromise between those two positions. Okay, so why did some in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, why did some oppose the people selecting? Because it was a concern about a lack of information. I mean, it's a rural agrarian society. There are no large cities. Information travels very differently. Politics was organized. This was prior to the formation of political parties. So there was not going to be campaigns. There was not going to be the kind of dissemination of information that will develop as technology changes over time. So there was a concern that ordinary voters, which is the great majority of Americans at the time, again, they're rural, they're far from the seat of power. The Constitution did establish Washington, D.C. as the capital, even though it took time for that to develop and be built, et cetera. And so there's concern that ordinary voters would simply lack the information necessary. And so that's why one position was oppose a popular election. And the other proposal, again, was have Congress select. Well, the opposition to that was the notion that, or was a concern that, it's a separation of powers issue, that if the president or the chief executive, that was a more common term than president or chief magistrate, is beholden to Congress for the position, then he probably is not, there's concern about how independent he would be. Would he be just a puppet of Congress, et cetera? So that's why there's this method of, this unusual method of selection is simply a compromise between those two positions. The debates in the convention went on for some time. This was one of the more lengthier issues that took time to move past and for them to reach agreement on. And so, but the thing is, it doesn't work as intended because political parties emerge. The original design was there are no parties. And so electors would be independent. So that, the notion was that I'm a farmer out in rural Pennsylvania or Virginia, wherever, everything is rural for the most part. I have some self-awareness that I'm not going to know very much about a candidate, say, from North Carolina or Connecticut or wherever. And so, but I will vote for an elector in my district because the electoral college is built, it follows the model of Congress, that the electoral college votes that a state has is based on the number of House seats it has plus two. So it's congressional delegation. So I will elect someone from my community that I can trust to gather information and make a decision really on the merits or based on that information rather than just guessing about about the differences between candidates of whom I know very little. But once political parties emerge, and they do very quickly by the third election, certainly by the election of 1800, that's the first election where candidates really are running under a party label, even though it looks very different than what that does today. And so it didn't. The Electoral College didn't work as intended for very long, and also that's a very unique period because it's the founding period. Washington is president. Everybody wanted Washington to be president. There was no competition for the presidency, Washington's first two terms. Once parties emerge, then electors are no longer independent because voters see themselves as committed to or supportive of one party or another. So that's why we have it. Initially, too, the Constitution made the vice president the runner-up in the Electoral College. Again, this is before parties emerge. And then what parties do is help organize campaigns. And now, of course, we have tickets where a presidential candidate will select a running mate. That's not anticipated at all by the Constitution. And the election of 1800 is the first time that that occurred. And so Adams was the incumbent running against Jefferson, the challenger. Jefferson had been Adams's vice president because he had finished second in the Electoral College in the election of 1796. And so the Constitution actually has been amended. The 12th Amendment amended the Article 2, where we find what I'm describing, to make it so that to remove this requirement that the vice president is simply the second place finisher in the Electoral College. So, but kind of one other point to make about the founding. Again, in the absence of political parties, parties help narrow and restrict the number of candidates, and so. But prior to parties, they anticipate numerous presidential candidates. And so what happened is the more candidates you have, the less likely that any candidate will win a majority of the Electoral College. And so what the Constitution does in that situation is that the House of Representatives selects. And so we've had two elections where the presidency has been selected by the House of Representatives. So it takes the top three finishers in the Electoral College. Each state has one vote, irrespective of their delegation in the House of Representatives. Those delegates, say Missouri, for example, today has 8 House seats. So if it were an election today, would go to the House of Representatives. Those 8 would have to decide among themselves. I'm sure they would vote across party lines how to cast the state's votes. But the founders really thought the House then would wind up selecting the president in most elections because of the very great likelihood that no candidate would receive a majority of the Electoral College votes. So today, so it's very different in some sense. In another, it's not different because it still controls the outcome of the election. Is that there are 538 votes in the Electoral College. That's based on 435 House members plus 100 senators, plus 3 in the early 1960s. The Constitution amended again to address the Electoral College, and the District of Columbia was given 3 Electoral College votes. And so there's a total of 538. The magic number, of course, is 270. That's a bare minimum majority. And so when we vote today, I always have fun with my students. I ask, what do you think you're doing when you cast a ballot for the presidency? Well, I'm voting for this candidate or that candidate. So actually, that's not what you're doing. You're expressing a preference as to how the state's electors, or who gets to cast the votes for the state on behalf or in the Electoral College, because candidates have a slate of electors pledged to them, and state law allows the parties to select who the electors are. They're not anonymous, but for all intents and purposes, they are, because it doesn't matter. We're not really voting for the electors. We're voting for who gets to cast the state's Electoral College votes. And so we tally the popular vote in each state, and that determines which party's electors get to cast the state's Electoral College votes. So.
Well, that's all really interesting information, and I've got a bunch of questions on my own, but let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and welcome Shane. I'm so glad you are able to get logged on. And I just want to check and make sure your microphone's working. Oh, cannot hear you. No. Well, while Shane tries to figure out why his microphone's not working, we could go ahead and pop over to, is it working now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Great.
The
That's
funny
what
thing is I didn't have my audio switched off, so I don't know what was going on.
you are having a day today. But
Yes,
we are so glad you're able to join us, and we know this is an extremely busy time of year for you. But we're glad that you're able to join us and to kind of tell us about how we have safe and secure elections, especially in the state of Missouri.
absolutely. Well, to everyone that's here today, thank you. We actually started our no excuse absentee voting this week, and I've been at the Library Center, which is a satellite location, yesterday and all day today. So that's why I wasn't on as timely as I need to be, because we've had over 2,200 people vote yesterday, and we're probably on track for that number or more to vote today. But pleased to be able to join and talk about safe and secure elections. I've talked to voters about that today. I've had voters that come in and say, well, how do I know it's tabulated my ballot, or do I get a receipt when I vote so I know it's tabulated correctly? And I let them know that we actually, after every election, on election night, we're going to draw from basically a bowl that has all the different voting locations in it, and we'll draw no less than 5% of the polling locations the day of the election. And we're going to go through and we're going to hand count after the election a federal statewide race. We'll hand count a legislative race, whether it's Missouri General Assembly or for Congress. Then we're also going to do a statewide race, for example, for U.S. Senate or anything of that nature, or a statewide race like governor. Then we'll also do one for a issue itself on the ballot. Then we're going to do one for the county, someone running for a county seat. And then we do one for the judiciary. So anything from the circuit to the appellate Supreme Court. We're actually going to go through and we're going to hand count that just to ensure that that count matches what the machine tallied on the day of the election. And I tell people I've been doing this now for the past 10 years. We've had ties, we've had one vote outcomes, and thus far we've not had a hand count that's overturned the machine count. And that's important for voters to know. We also test the machines before. We test them afterwards in terms of a test deck that's been hand counted to make sure it's accurately tabulating the vote as well. And so that's important for people to know, because a lot of people do have questions. We also have bipartisan teams that are watching the chain of custody process in terms of the moment we're receiving those ballots to the moment that we're issuing the polling locations to even issuing them here during absentee voting period. We're keeping count of all those ballots as they are issued to make sure that we have a proper chain of custody process too.
All right, thanks. We've already got some questions started
Good.
for both of you. So we'll hear from Suzanne and then we'll start asking questions. So Suzanne, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks. So before talking about where we can all find nonpartisan factual sources of information to prepare for the upcoming election and subsequent elections, I just wanted to mention a few things about the importance of finding these sorts of resources and using them. So obviously these days, not everyone is watching the evening news with Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather, and some of the audience may not be familiar with these names. But anyway, the most important thing is that not everyone is receiving their information from the same sources. Events and occurrences happen that some people are aware of and some are not, based on where they get their information. There are vast differences in the way various media outlets present the same issues or occurrences as well. And then you've got a lot of people getting their information from TikTok, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, depending upon their age group. And we know all of these use algorithms that ensure a continued stream of information that's in agreement with our already existing perspectives and the like-minded people that we associate with. So this increases partisanship, and that term, that partisan, has changed in the U.S. quite a bit. An individual's partisan tendencies used to be determined more by their voting behavior, but now it seems to refer more to a psychological identification with a major political party. So it's dangerous for society because it prevents civil discourse. It prevents us being able to discuss issues respectfully, to build understanding, and that would enable us to work together towards a common goal. And it's key for democratic citizenship. So nonpartisanship, or being free from party affiliation or bias, allows us to focus on issues rather than political parties. And in the case of Pause to the Polls, the voter education initiative here on campus, we focus on access to the information necessary to participate in the democratic process, as well as nonpartisan sources to help people decide who or what to vote for on their own. They do the work. We, provide websites, apps, etc., sources, and then people on their own go and do their investigating. So it's clear from voting behavior, at least, I mean, for example, here in Greene County, people are able to come to agreement more on issues frequently than on political parties. And often we're trying to, for issues, we're trying to solve a problem or take advantage of, an opportunity that might benefit a lot of people. But for issues, there's at least the possibility for middle ground, but it's not really the case for political identity, particularly with Republican and Democrat. It's kind of, frequently one or the other. And so for the issues, there's no identity associated. We're just looking at that issue itself. So I want to take the opportunity for a moment just to talk about ballot measures, because we've got several on the ballot this election. And the first thing is to know what a ballot measure actually says and what it means. And that can be kind of challenging. Sometimes the language isn't necessarily all that clear, but it can also be helpful to know how a ballot measure originates. And so in Missouri, we've got 6 ballot measures to vote on. 4 of them are on the ballot due to the ballot initiative process. That allows citizens to propose statutes or constitutional amendments through the initiative petition process. You may have signed one of these petitions at some point over the last couple of years. And those are Amendment 2, Sports Betting Initiative, Amendment 3, Right to Reproductive Freedom Initiative, Amendment 5, Osage River Gambling Boat License Initiative, and Proposition A, a minimum wage and earned paid sick time initiative. And then the other 2 are legislative ballot measures. And that's where legislators voted to place these constitutional amendments on the ballot. So those are Amendment 6, and that was via Senate Joint Resolution 71. And that's about defining the administration of justice to include the levying of costs and fees to support salaries and benefits of law enforcement personnel. And then Amendment 7, Senate Joint Resolution 78, that's to prohibit ranked choice voting and then also the state and local governments from allowing non-citizens to vote. So, and something to keep in mind is that it is illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal and state elections already. So anyone who fills out a voter registration form as a non-citizen is committing perjury if they are trying to vote. And then illegally voting can result in fine up to a year in prison, federal prison, and possible deportation, revocation of their legal status. So those are what's on the ballot in terms of ballot measures in Missouri. But going back to nonpartisan resources and nonpartisanship. So first of all, nonpartisanship is actually the most effective way to reach people. And instead of trying to convince people to vote one way or another, staying neutral and providing information, just basic information, like the real message of the importance of voting and finding out facts, then will be the one that is heard, ideally. And it's only when we use these unbiased information sources that we can have productive discussions of issues and include people with widely divergent views. And then we can come together, maybe identify common goals, common ground, and that can happen. I check out the Braver Angels website, for example, an organization that formed back in 2016 with 2 people in Ohio, one Democrat, one Republican, that got together and trying to combat severe extreme partisanship even at that time. And now it has chapters in, I believe, every state, or at least just about every state. And this encourages cross the aisle communication. And it's a pretty amazing organization. And then that polarization and extremism that we see as well is also caused very likely in part by lack of voter participation. So some would say getting more people out to vote can reduce that polarization somewhat. So only about 17%, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jane, voted in the primary in August, certainly less than 20%.
We had a little over 23% here in
23%. Okay, got up to 23. That's good to know. Okay. So that's still a pretty vast minority of eligible voters that were voting in the primary. And so the ones that vote might tend to be the ones that are the most passionate, most motivated to actually vote. And they might represent views that at least according to some research, that are farther from sort of that middle ground. And when the more extreme candidates win primaries, and they're the ones that appear on the ballot in the general elections in November, there are a lot of people that feel like, hey, this party is not representing my interests. And so that can lead to further disengagement and even lower civic participation. So if more people are letting their voices be heard in all the elections, local, primaries, etc., then that can do a lot towards, trying to be able to reach some common ground and hopefully prevent some of that extremism. So, and in the past, sometimes when I'll mention nonpartisan sources of information, that's kind of the core of what Pause to the Polls does is provide access to that. Sometimes someone will respond with, yeah, right, all media is biased. How do you get around that? But I think it's useful to divide political resources up into three main categories, and someone in communication might do this a different way, but I think it's useful to think about news sources as one area, one category, fact-checking resources as another category, and then nonpartisan websites and apps with that are about political information as yet another one. And I'm going to share the screen here for just a moment. Hopefully, actually it's saying host disabled screen sharing. Not sure if you can allow me to share this, or if one of you could share that PowerPoint. Let's try again.
Suzanne will try to get that set for you.
Or if you have that email with the PowerPoint, that you can just pull that PowerPoint up either way. Okay, excellent. All right. So this media bias chart was produced by Ad Fontes Media, and a patent attorney actually started this off, Vanessa Otero. And so news sources are often accused of bias. And so one way, this is an interactive website actually, and viewer input helps to rate these sources. And one way to see media bias on your own is to look at this website called All Sides, and that provides articles on the same story from the left, right, and center perspectives. And it's very interesting. It helps us analyze how bias is created and perpetuated. So I'm going to share a few tips about avoiding misinformation and bias. And this is so important because the media have a lot of power in setting cultural guidelines and shaping political discourse. So it's important to challenge bias and misinformation to be fair and accurate. And actually, Marianne, are the slides showing up okay, just to be sure?
Yes, they look good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so first, it's a good idea to have an open mind and realize that we don't know everything, and be open to learn new things that might be different from what our friends tell us on Facebook or the Instagram post that you saw yesterday. So one of the first things is actually reading about who produces a website. What's their mission statement? Who's their leadership? And are there quotes from professionals that have expertise in those relevant fields that are quoted? And if they're quotes from a particular person, can fact check those. And did that person say those things? And again, do they have, the kind of authority to make those statements? Do headlines match the story? Sometimes headlines, you can see a headline and then it's kind of misleading and doesn't necessarily match up with what's in the story. If photos are questionable, there's two people together and saying, look at these two, these are good buddies, there's this long time association. you can do a reverse image search and find out where either that came from or where those individual photos came from, to see if they were actually really together or not. And then also, the diversity of personnel of a website should reflect the communities that it serves, and then that relates whether the perspectives of those that are affected by a particular issue is represented in their coverage. And then other things to watch for are extreme language. So extreme language or loaded language really does influence public opinion. And then also the appeal to emotions rather than logic. Emotion makes people a lot less discerning. And so this is just a psychological fact. And there also tends to be a oversimplification or overgeneralization a lot of times. There aren't easy answers to very many problems. And so presenting an easy answer sometimes is going to be misleading and often biased. And then also just a limited view of the topic, and that relates to oversimplification as well. And then also websites that are dedicated only to controversial topics. Sometimes those might be more likely to have a bias. And then we look for alternative points of view. Ideally, there should be alternative points of view that are mentioned in on a website in media. And so things that you can do to help limit this misinformation is to do a little bit of work, basically do a little bit of homework, and be prepared to locate that accurate information. And if somebody shares inaccurate information or biased information, you can let them know in a diplomatic, non-confrontational way and say, hey, I read this other, this other article or this other source. Why don't you maybe take a look at that, or check out Snopes or whatever other fact-checking resource. And this might also spare them future embarrassment. And because if somebody else is going to point out that was inaccurate down the line, then again, that might save them from embarrassment at that time. All right. So again, that's second. So that's sort of media sources, news sources. And then these fact-checking resources are incredibly helpful. And things like PolitiFact. And these this is owned by a Pulitzer Prize-winning institute, the Poynter Institute, and that operates this IFCN, which is the International Fact-Checking Network, and that sets standards for fact-checkers. And it rates the accuracy of claims by those involved in U.S. politics, for example. And factcheck.org is run by Annenberg Public Policy Center, and this is a nonprofit, nonpartisan voter advocate organization that aims to reduce deception and confusion in our politics. And then there's science feedback, and top researchers that publish a lot in peer-reviewed journals are the ones that are doing the fact checking. This is also part of the IFCN network. And there are two separate websites, one related to climate-related claims and others to health and medical claims. So those are actually, again, very useful, especially if you're arguing with somebody. And then this third category of unbiased sources of political information. So the first one is really just a resource for voting itself, usvotefoundation.org. And then the others are more for trying to educate yourself before an election. So VoteSmart provides unbiased information on candidates via various kind of categories of information. And then ActiVote is a great app that you can download, and it's got on elected officials, candidates, current legislation, ballot issues, etc. And then Ballot Ready, that's something you can sign up for and plug in your name and address, and then you can go to the categories of information that you want, environment, mental health care, whatever, and see where candidates stand on those issues. So those are all, again, very, very helpful kinds of sites. And I'll tell you where to go to get these sources as well. Excuse me. So our website has a lot of information that can help get ready for this upcoming election as well as subsequent ones. And I'll go to that website in just a moment here. But first of all, the polling place, the central polling location for the November 5th election will be the Great Southern Bank Arena here on the MSU campus. And that is one of a few different central polling locations. And we appreciate the work of some several years ago, the Office of Public Affairs Support, working with our county clerk, Shane Scholler, to be able to bring that central polling location here. And that's an amazing resource for us to have. And we can ask for a more fair and responsive county clerk actually than Shane Scholler, just feeling very secure in the elections and the transparency of the whole process. He's always ready to provide that information. And on the website, we've got information guide, this voter ready guide, and then resources with links to candidate interviews for 3 counties around here in this local area, as well as voter guide by the League of Women Voters. So you can get a lot of information right there. And that voter guide also includes statements all the way down the ballot, by up and down the ballot and down to the judges, things like that. Often we don't think about that. And there's also a section for finding your own personal ballot by entering your address. It shows you the website to go to do that, to find exactly what will be on your ballot. And one important thing to keep in mind, especially for new voters, you don't have to vote for everything on your ballot still counts. So if you don't know everything, you don't know what judges you want to vote for, or what one ballot measure might mean, what the results might be, then you don't have to vote for that. Just vote for what you know. So go to this. I'm not sure if this one actually went to the website. I don't think that it did. There we go. Okay. So on the website, for example, so there are a number of things on here about registering at home versus registering at school, where you might want to vote, and how you can register to vote, and where you can actually vote. But also there is this November 5th voter that up near the top, the November 5th voter education resources. Right up there. There you go. Note November 5th voter information resources there on the right. That has, if you click on that, and then we can take a look, so that it's something that you can either look at online, or we have printed versions with a link tree as well. But if you go on the middle of the second page there, under nonpartisan resources, that has Informed Voter Coalition candidate interviews. If you wouldn't mind clicking on that link there, and that goes to hopefully if you click on that, it should go to the actual interviews. There we go. And so from well, unfortunately, it goes to an ad, but that will go to the Informed Voter Coalition candidate interviews. And you can also go to KSMU website. They've got a lot of election information as well. And then Marianne, if you mind clicking on that League of Women Voters voter guide also. Yes, thank you. And good, it's not another ad. And so that voter guide, if you just scroll way down, it's got, again, the candidates and both all the candidates basically were asked, no matter what their political party, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, Green. So anytime there is a candidate for anything, they are asked. And even way down, it's very long, as you can see. And so 40 pages long. So even if you go all the way down like to the judges, it's got statements by those judges. So that is a very useful way to find your information. And they were all requested information. Not 100% of the candidates respond, but that's the goal, is to try to get full response. So it's, again, got all the federal candidates, state, and further down as well. So and actually another place, if you go back to that voter ready page, that voter ready PDF, Marianne, there we are, perfect. Find your ballot. So if you go to sos.mo.gov, you can go to just find your own personal ballot, and then you can print that out and take it with you. You can take whatever information you want to the polls. A lot of new voters especially think it's cheating to take a sheet or a filled out ballot or something, but you can use your phone, you can use paper. You just can't take somebody to tell you how to vote with you, but you can have all that information when you go to vote. So, and the ballot measures are listed on there as well. So that's basically it for those nonpartisan resources. But again, those are provided there on the Pause the Polls website, which is very easy to find, maintained by the Public Affairs Support Office, actually.
Well, we know there are a lot of resources on that page, and I encourage everyone to go to the Pause the Polls website and check out those resources. It takes a little while. This election ballot this year is going to be very full, not just with candidates, but with issues. And we all know that sometimes those issues are worded in a way that if you vote yes, you mean no, and if you vote no, you mean yes. And so it really behooves you to read it beforehand so that you know how you want to vote before. I guess I've been voting in elections for a really long time and had never really thought about the fact that, yeah, I could bring a piece of paper in with me to the voting booth. We do have several. I want to go ahead and get to those before we run out of time, but this one is for Kevin. So you talked about the popular vote and the Electoral College. I guess this is maybe an opinion question. You may or may not want to answer it, but would the popular vote be more fair?
Depends on how you define fair. I mean, there are problems with a popular vote as well. You know, one problem with a popular vote is it would invite, Shane could speak to this maybe, but it would incentivize more fraud because fraud is easier to contain, I think, and combat under the Electoral College. But if you have, so it would incentivize the possibility of fraud at every precinct across the nation. A direct election. So, and then in terms of fairness, you know, one of our current very deep partisan divides is geographic in nature between urban and rural. And so there's a fairness question about having urbanites dominate presidential politics. And so I mean, there's no silver bullet. There are problems, and I think with a direct election or a popular election, just as there are problems with or ways to conceive of the Electoral College is unfair. But a direct election also would open up the possibility of a really fringe candidate winning, right? Because that would incentivize and maybe strengthen the possibility of a minor party or what we call minor third parties. What are you going to do in a popular election or a direct election when no one gets a majority? And so it's not inconceivable that someone could become president with winning 30% of the vote or 33% of the popular vote, because it's very likely that a popular vote we would see. I mean, on one hand, it might be good to have more choices than between two major parties, but you should also be careful what you wish for in terms of what I've just described. So that possibility would be opened up by a direct election. So, that you know, there's arguments to be made for and against virtually every method of selection. But so I don't know if you know, I don't think the Electoral College itself is unfair because it takes in, you know, again, people are unhappy with it, or at least Democrats are unhappy with it. And if the, you know, if roles were reversed, Republicans would be too. But you know, that's how it's designed. Popular elections, I mean, that possibility was rejected. And so popular election is just never been of constitutional consequence.
Shane, do you have any
Well, I
comments?
might
toward
add
that?
in that one of the things the founding fathers were really conscientious of is that England, of course, King George, basically was the tyranny of one. They were also very conscientious about the tyranny of the majority. And they wanted to protect people who were not the majority to have a voice. And that's one of the reasons the Electoral College was created, so that you wouldn't concentrate just in the big states where all the popular vote is, and then forget about the other states that may have less population. And so their reason is they worked through to create a constitutional Electoral College was we always want to make sure that if you're not in the majority, your voice is still protected in the process, whether it's the legislature or the electoral colleges which choose president. That's something we need to keep in mind as we think about the popular vote, that every vote is important, but it's also important that we not forget about those who may not be in the majority, that they still have a place at the table too.
Okay, so kind of on that similar line about the secure procedures and everything, but do all states have the same security procedures? You talked about what we do here in Greene County and in Missouri, but is that nationwide or?
No, because one of the things in the Constitution is that each state is responsible for its own elections. Now, clearly in the federal election, as we know, the U.S. Department of Justice has a civil rights portion that ensures that we protect everyone. But at the end of the day, the actual laws in terms of the hours, the procedures, all of those things, those are actually done state by state. In Missouri, we're very fortunate that we have laws that are conscientious in terms of making sure we have bipartisanship, making sure that we're thinking through as we use, tabulation equipment, making sure that that's fair, that there's checks and balances on all of that. And of course, part of that's because of our past history back in the 30s and prior to that, and even after that, there was a lot of coercion that took place when ballots were hand counted. They would coerce the people that were there checking in the voters, just like you see today. They were changing voted ballots. I've got a great article from 1955, the St. Louis Club Democrat, where they actually went to the voting machines during that period of time because they were tired of the voted ballots being changed. They were tired of the person who was calling the ballot for the candidate they preferred versus who the individual voted for. They were tired of stuffing the ballot boxes. And so some of the very election laws we have today came from that. For example, I had some people, I mentioned this earlier, they wanted a receipt that prints after they vote, so they know who they voted for. One of the things I try to remind them of is that there was a day and time where people came out and they basically would have their ballot filled out and they would come back in the polling location and cast it. Well, if you had a receipt system, you could very easily have people being coerced to say, we want to see how you voted on the day of the election. So we've got to have that right balance between knowing how you, making sure that the tabulation of the ballots is correct, but also not compromising people and their independence to be able to vote privately without anyone coercing them when they do that. And that's one of the reasons we have the bipartisanship that we have today. That is critical to that. If you get one party, that could very easily create issues. Years ago, there would even be people who would stand up in a polling location and direct everyone in that polling location as to how to vote. So that's why we've had the bipartisanship. That's why we make sure that you're able to vote privately in the booth by yourself without anyone telling you how to vote. And other states have similar laws. One of the challenges we have today, though, is as we've seen voting modernized in terms of some people prefer to vote by mail, some people prefer to vote in person. But some of these states, for example, one of the challenges we have with them now is that they don't get to begin opening up their ballots until the day of the election. Well, if you begin to get the majority of your ballots being mailed in, not opened up until election day, you've got a real problem there in terms of being able to report those results that night. Well, what does that do? Even if the election official is doing everything correctly, people begin to assume something's wrong because the results have not been reported quickly on the night of the election. So we're really fortunate here in Missouri. Most voters do vote in person, although clearly we make sure that if you need to vote by mail, if you're out of town, if you're sick, if you have a religious reason, that right is protected for you. But I certainly, as an election official, prefer voting in person because one, we know that ballot is cast. And then two, we don't have to worry about that ballot potentially getting lost if it's mailed back. That's an issue. So we have a lot of pluses there. But other states have not updated their laws. For example, Georgia, one of the things they do with their election equipment is, and I don't know if they still do this today, but I believe they do. They, through the state, they purchase all their election equipment for the entire state. And one of the challenges they had going back to 2018 was they were not protecting the codes to that equipment. Someone was able to literally write a coding program that was able to decode how to get into and see the passwords and different things of the election system there in the state of Georgia. And so they have been improving things since then. But the reason I make that point is if you have an issue with your election laws, close elections rebuild them. Almost every time. Or if you have an issue with your election administration, close elections show that. When you have wide margins, you're not going to see the issues because the candidate or the issue won by a wide margin, people are not examining that. But when you get close elections, especially presidential, U.S. Senate, governor, for example, that's when the issues with your voting laws or the administration election, that's when they become known, because then a lot more people begin to ask questions about how that election was conducted. So we're fortunate in our state. We would definitely want to encourage other states to be similar, and we still can improve here in our state, but overall we do a really good job, and I'm really pleased that we do the elections the way we do here in our state.
So you mentioned absentee balloting.
Yes.
And we have a couple questions on that, and I
Okay.
think you kind of alluded to this in your last few statements in there. But when the county clerk's office receives an absentee ballot in the mail, do you open it as soon as you receive it and tabulate it, or do you open it the day of the election?
State statute allows us 5 days before the election, meaning 5 actual days, not business days, that we begin to open with bipartisan teams. You can actually have a watcher there to watch the entire process. That's when we begin to open and separate the ballots from the envelope. Now, we're assuring that the signature matches before we do that. We have the signature on file, the voter that returns that ballot. That is checked. Then the ballot is opened. It's separated. Those ballots are actually not tallied until election day. And they are at that point on election morning, whatever time, you can begin to tally those votes, and then they are uploaded after the polls close at 7 o'clock. But in order to ensure that no one is getting tipped on how one candidate is doing or how an issue may be doing, that's why ballots are not tallied until the day of the election.
And just kind of to clarify, if someone does not get their ballot in time, absentee, what happens with that ballot?
Well, if you're not military or overseas, it does have to be returned by the night of the election at 7 o'clock. If you're military or overseas, you have either till Friday or Monday. I say that because normally it's Friday, but this election, Veterans Day, is actually going to be, I believe, on Friday. So we have till Monday for the ballots to be received, because we'll be closed on Friday. But either way, military and overseas come in then. They have to be in by noon of Friday or that Monday, and then those are added in as well. But all absentee ballots for most people do need to be returned by 7 o'clock on that election. And we do tell people that if you cannot, if you know, for example, your ballot didn't come in time, you're here in town, we have an affidavit people can sign saying I have not voted the ballot yet at this point, and then they go ahead and cast their ballot at the polling location. And so that is not uncommon. Or maybe they got their ballot, thought they're going to be out of town, they're not. They can come and surrender that ballot and vote the ballot on the day of the election, or even prior during the absentee voting period. They can do it in person.
Okay. And so you mentioned earlier that there are people there at the polling booth, both observers and volunteers who are working the polls. How do you hire those volunteers in Greene County? What are the qualifications? And then this is a direct quote: can these people mess with the ballots?
Understood. Well, first of all, by statute, we're supposed to get our election judges through our central committees of each party. So on December 10th of this year, by statute, in a even numbered year, we're supposed to receive twice the number of election judges we need to conduct a general election 2 years from then. Does that happen in our state? Not that I'm aware of. That has not become a common practice. So we do work with our parties first, or committees, but realistically, they don't get us the number of election judges we need. So we do advertise it on our website. We do go to the media if necessary. We work with both, of course, here in Springfield News Leader, KY3, Color 10, those outlets, Springfield Daily Citizen. We work with all of them to get the word out that we do need election judges. And the statute does allow us to do that. They then let us know what party preference they prefer, whether it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, could be Libertarian, for example, Green Party, which we've had in the past too. All of those people are allowed to serve as election judges during the day of the election. In terms of how the ballots, the question about being messed with, that's where the chain of custody process comes in. That's critical. Matter of fact, one of the best things about 2020, we received more ballots by mail historically in Greene County than any other period of time that I'm aware of. And so what we did is we looked at our forms as ballots are being received in, first to be issued out to the polling location and or for absentee voting, as well as the ballots are being returned by mail. We simplified, but also increased the number of the chain of custody documentation to make sure that every time that ballot moves, we have documentation following that. So either their deputy clerk sworn in by the office, they've taken an oath, they're either part of that process or we have a bipartisan team that's part of that process. And so we are working constantly to make sure all of that is done correctly and with one Republican, one Democrat, ideally.
Okay, well, we are just about out of time, but I wanted to give everyone a minute or so to, if you had any closing comments or things that you'd like to say in a wrap up before we go. Kevin, do you have anything?
I guess I will end on a note of despair, at least for those who want to end or do away with the Electoral College. That will take a constitutional amendment. The Constitution has only been amended 27 times in its history, indicating it's very hard to amend. And so there's an effort out there called I forget what it's called, where states are entering into a compact to require their electors to vote consistently with the national vote. And so it's an open question as to whether that will be constitutional or not, should it succeed. It hasn't yet. I think 15 states have changed their laws to require that. And it doesn't become operative to those 15 until there's a minimum of 270 electoral college, or the states adding up to 270 electoral college votes. But so that's a way to try to end run the amendment requirement, but it's not. I'm not sure that will stand up to constitutional scrutiny.
Okay, Shane, would you have any closing words for us?
As you get ready for this election, I think, of course, Dr. Pacheco mentioned this, but make sure that you're studying that ballot prior to the election, because there's almost 50 questions front and back that are on that ballot. And just to encourage you, I think sometimes people think about not voting because they're like, well, maybe I don't know all the issues, or I just don't know the candidates well enough. Everyone has been at that point. And I can guarantee that if you take time to study the issues through some of the organizations that Dr. Pacheco mentioned, but also you can go do your own research. You can look and see what the candidates and or the people behind or for against the issues say. That's critical, but be part of the conversation. That's the most important thing. I always tell people, I've, in my past, especially, when I was in school as a kid, sometimes left out of conversations. That's never a good feeling. We want everyone to be part of this conversation in terms of here's what we're thinking about for our local governance at the county level. Here's what we're thinking about the state legislature and our state constitution and our statutes. And here's what we're thinking about in terms of who should be representing this at the federal level. We need your voice to be part of that.
Okay. And Dr. Walker Pacheco?
All right. Yes, no, just we'll be there. Positive polls is typically on hand, tabling from about 9 to 5 or later on election day at the central polling location on campus. So we answer questions and we've got voter guides there. So a lot of times people come last minute and they haven't had time to research things. So we've just got those access to the information so they can step aside and, take a look at the ballot, look at the guide, make their decisions before they go in. So, and then again, if they haven't familiarized themselves with everything, you don't have to vote for everything on the ballot. And also keeping in mind that president is not the only thing on the ballot. And so if they don't like those choices, they can move on down and they've got plenty of other offices to vote for.
Well, I want to thank all of you for taking your time and sharing your knowledge and information with us. I think we've just barely scratched the tip of the iceberg, but you've given us lots of great things to think about. I want to encourage everyone that if you know people that were not able to be here today to check out the recording. It will be available on publicaffairs.missouri-state.edu in the next day or so. And as all of our guests have mentioned, educate yourself, go out, vote, and let your voice be heard. Thank you very much for joining us.